Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new show on the Muscle Cat Media Network, the Outdoor Ginger podcast. You may have heard of him, you may not, but he's taken the internet by storm. He's a 20-year-old Danish man who camps in the wilderness in Europe and he's going to do the US this year as well. And he lets you inside his tent on our podcast, the Outdoor Ginger podcast. See, I'm so used to saying Outback Quarterback podcast that I almost said Outback Ginger. It's Outdoor Ginger. Look him up on Instagram. Give him a follow. The first episode is out now. He sits in his garden. He has a sandwich. He sits by the fire. He tells you about his expeditions, what he's doing next, and a friend even drops by for a chat. It's a great addition to the network. It's something very different. He's a funny guy. He's a great dude. Make sure you listen. The Outdoor Ginger podcast. All right, today we're kicking off our season reviews. I'm going to review every single team's season on the Outback QB Daily podcast, starting the Las Vegas Raiders. Good morning, everybody. Curtis DeBoer here with you on the Muscle Cat Media Network, and this is the stuff I really love doing. Looking at every team, how did they do? Let's give them a bit of a report card. I won't give them a grade, but I'll go through everything: the highlights, lowlights, how their draft class performed, how their free agency and trade acquisitions performed, things that they need going forward, their stat leaders, MVP votes, all that sort of stuff. So let's get into it. The Las Vegas Raiders, I mean, they had a bad season. Again, it's the third losing season in a row. 4-13 they ended up, and we know now that they sacked Antonio Pierce. So that's why I'm starting with them, because they're news relevant at the moment. They're looking for their head coach. And Tom Brady apparently has reached out to Bill Belichick. So that's interesting. Could Bill Belichick end up with Tom Brady reunited again? I mean, I know he's just committed. He's a college football coach now. Leave him alone, guys. But apparently, the question has been asked. So we'll track that one with interest over the next weeks, months, however long this takes. But 4-13, the Raiders. Tom Telesco, their general manager, you'll remember he came across from the LA Chargers at the end of last year or the start of this year. He was there for 10 years. The fans wanted him out after a while because they seemed to be going nowhere. So he took over the Raiders. And, you know, we'll get to his draft in a second and see how that went. But let's start with the good stuff. Let's start with the highlights for the Raiders this year. I'll go with 2 highlights and 2 lowlights, even though there were a lot more lowlights. Number one, obviously, the highlight is Brock Bowers. You can't go past that. He was picked 13 in the draft. At the time, a few of us, myself included, thought, they've got Michael Mayer. Isn't Michael Mayer good? He was a second-round tight end picked up last year, and he showed some flashes in his first year. But in their wisdom, and they got this one obviously brilliantly right, Brock Bowers is a far greater talent, a far greater NFL-ready tight end. In fact, he was the best tight end in football this year, you could say with a very straight face, because he led receptions and he led yards. He didn't lead touchdowns, but he was huge. He had 112 receptions, 1,194 yards first year, 5 touchdowns. He broke all the records: receiving yards for rookie tight end, reception record for the rookie tight end, reception record for rookies of any position, and he's in the Pro Bowl, and he'll be an All-Pro, I think. So look at that. Unbelievable. Brock Bowers, well done. Number 2, their second highlight, was somehow, and we still haven't figured this out, beating the Baltimore Ravens in Baltimore in week 2, 26-23. That was a game where Devonta Adams was big before he got traded. 5 votes he got in our MVP that day, 110 yards on 9 receptions and a touchdown. Max Crosby had 4 tackles for loss, including 2 sacks. That was probably his best game of the year, one of his best games of the year, certainly, in a year that didn't fully get going for Crosby and ended in an injury. But the lowlights, and there were plenty, I'm packing 10 weeks into one lowlight because it was a 10-game losing streak. And for those who go, why did Antonio Pierce get fired? I mean, guys, 10-game losing streak. They went from 2-2 to 2-12. And the second lowlight, it sort of links to that, because they lost their big acquisition, their defensive tackle, Christian Wilkins. Came over from Miami on big money. Started okay, started decently. Had a couple of games with a sack or 2. Wasn't super dominant, but you could see the chemistry was starting to come together between Wilkins and Crosby. But then they lost him to a Jones fracture in his foot. He had surgery after week 5, and he has not played since. So they obviously want to get him right next year, but they lost him a quarter of the way into the season. Then they lose Crosby to the ankle surgery in week 14. And there was no surprise that without Wilkins, it started to plummet because that was going to be what they were built around, right? That tough D-line with Tyree Wilson developing, which he did. He came on this year and maybe he was given more opportunities due to the injuries to other guys. But that 10-game losing streak kicked off really when Wilkins was down and out. So that was a low light because they put so much in the Wilkins basket. Let's have a look at their stats. Who actually performed for them? Who were the leaders in their stats? Well, Gardner Minshew, he played 10 games at QB. O'Connell played 9. I mean, they shared the starts. There were a couple of games where they both played. Minshew just went over 2,000 yards. O'Connell 1,600 yards. Minshew's passer rating was 81. O'Connell's was 86. Touchdown to interception ratio, 9 touchdowns to 10 interceptions for Minshew, 8-4 for O'Connell. I think O'Connell was marginally better, but he's up and down as well. I mean, neither of them are the answer. We know that. They'll be going back to the draft or maybe trades or free agency for a quarterback. Desmond Ridder even played a little bit towards the end of the year, but we know what we think of Des. Rushing-wise, this was the worst statistical category for them. They were the worst rushing game in the league by far. By far, 79 yards per game. The second worst was the Jets with 91. They were way off. And you'll remember they got rid of Josh Jacobs in free agency. They released him, and he went to the Packers and was dominant. So Alexander Mattison, after a bad year as the attempted lead running back of the Vikings last year, he was just as bad. 3.2 yards per carry, only 420 yards and 4 TDs for the year. Amir Abdullah deputized. Sincere McCormack was the only guy who really showed some spark, and that was in just 2 games as a rookie late in the season, and then he got injured, so didn't really do much after that. Zamir White played 8 games, only 183 yards at 2.8 per carry, so there's no juice there whatsoever. They need to address that big time. Yes, that's a bit on the O-line, but they have just no talent at the running game. They just don't. Receivers, Brock Bowers, we said, was the leader in all categories for them. Jacoby Myers, their wide receiver. Now, he's not a wide receiver 1. He's playing as a wide receiver 1 for them because they've got no other talent on the roster. But he's a good 2 or 3, and he actually went over 1,000 yards this year. So if you can get a proper number 1 receiver, like, I don't know, Devonta Adams, but they got rid of him, and for good reason, although they only end up with a 3rd-round pick for him because he didn't make All-Pro. Well, he won't make All-Pro, so it was a 3rd right for Devonta. You'd want it to be a 2nd, really, but that is what it is. But Myers is a good number 2. He went over 1,000 yards, 1,027 and 4 touchdowns. Trey Tucker, young receiver, went for 500 yards, and there wasn't much outside of that. Defensively, Robert Spillane had a pretty good year. I mean, he was top 3 in tackles for the league with 158. Had a couple of sacks, a couple of interceptions. Like I said, he's an underrated player, and he just pops up when the time is right in games. He has a knack of doing that. Jack Jones led interceptions, the cornerback, with 3, but he also gave up 10 touchdowns. 10 touchdowns, which is the most in the league this year. So I'll get to the secondary in a second. Daniel Carlson had a decent year as their kicker, 34 of 30. So that's not his best year, not his worst year. Well, it might actually be his worst year. I'll double check that. But let's have a look at the MVP votes because, as you guys know by now, the Stubby Club MVP award, Matt and I and Chris helped in the first half of the season, but it ended up being Doss and I. We went through every game, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it's pretty good, I think. I think it's pretty good. It gives a nice indication of who performed when. It helps us notice trends because guys get hot and cold during the season. It's hard to keep track of that. But when we've got this spreadsheet of all this data in front of us of how we've rated every single game, it's pretty cool. It was a very time-consuming exercise, but great fun. Now let's have a look. Brock Bowers. Well, for context, I should say the Raiders have the 3rd lowest amount of votes out of all the teams. They got 73 across the course of the year. And for comparison, the team with the most votes was the Detroit Lions, and they got 199. So they weren't the worst, the Raiders, but they were 3rd worst. Brock Bowers, he was their best player according to our MVP, and that's correct. I mean, you can't argue with that, I don't think. At 21 votes for him, he polled 6 times. He got 1 best on ground. He probably would have had a lot more if they won a few more games, but 21 votes is huge for a rookie. Max Crosby, he was next, and he missed the last quarter of the season. Keep that in mind. He polled 8 votes. 3 times he polled, including that Week 2 win against Baltimore. That was our best game for him. Robert Spillane, the guy that I like, the linebacker, he was 3rd with 7 votes. Jack Jones was 4th, but that all came, he got 5 votes, and that was all one game where he got best on ground 2 weeks ago. Outside of that, he had a really bad year. So that shows you just how sparse the good performances were for the Raiders this year, because a guy who polled well in one game, despite having a lot of bad games, came fourth with 5 votes. Minshew and O'Connell both picked up 4 votes. Tyree Wilson, he had a game where he got 4 votes. That was a couple of weeks ago. Outside of that, Adam Butler, DJ Glaze, Trayvon Merrick, Myers, Wilkins, Chason, Diablo, Miller, their offensive tackle, and Amir Abdullah. They all polled, but only once and only minor votes. So that's across 17 weeks. There you go. Bowers, Crosby, Spillane. So let's have a look at their draft class. Bowers, we know. Pick 13, tick. Round 2, they went for Jackson Powers Johnson, pick 44. Now, he is a guard. He's a flexible player. I think he's played some center in college as well. He slid. A lot of people, including myself, had him as a first rounder, and he slid to mid-second. So it was a good pick, and he actually played well. He had a good year, Jackson Powers Johnson, and this was a big tick because they struggled with guard play last year. They desperately needed a guard, and he had a bit of a bumpy start, but that's to be expected. He got into his groove. He even had a couple of games where he was perfect. Not a pressure allowed, no hits, no sacks, no hurries, not even a penalty. So he had 2 perfect games, including Week 17 against the Saints. So that was really good, and that came in a win as well. That was great for the Raiders and for Tommy Telesco. That's a good start. That's a good pick. And the even better statistic is that he only conceded 2 sacks for the entire year, which was great. Then we go to the 3rd round, and they picked a tackle, Delmar Glaze. And it was an interesting one because he gave up a stack of pressures, 51 of them, compared to only 25 for Jackson Powers Johnson. So 51 for Glaze. But he only gave up 3 sacks. So it was a lot of hurries, but he didn't actually let the opponents get to the quarterback a lot. So I don't know. The jury's out there. I mean, he started a lot of snaps. He played pretty much the whole year after week 3. So that's good. That's a tick. He's got some experience. Didn't give up many sacks in his first year. Massive tick. Gave up a lot of pressure. So if you can tidy that up, then maybe they've got a tackle to go along with their guard, and maybe this O-line starts to come together. The O-line generally, they gave up 50 sacks this year, which was 8th worst. So not awful, but certainly room for improvement. Their 4th rounder, that's the last pick I'll talk about. That was Decamerion Richardson, I should say, cornerback, and he struggled. And they desperately need help in that secondary, which we'll talk about in a second as well. Trades and free agents. So like I said, they brought in Gardner Minshew. That's a bridge quarterback. We know that. Christian Wilkins they brought in, got injured. They let go Jacobs. They also traded out Devontae Adams for that 3rd round pick. It was a conditional. He could have been a 2nd, but it ends up being a 3rd. So what do they need? Where do they go from here, the Raiders? Well, it's pretty grim, and it's going to be grim for a few of these early season review shows because by the very nature of it, I'm doing the teams whose seasons are over, and that means they are not in playoffs. And they're not in playoffs for a reason. So they were 27th in offensive yards this year. They were 29th in points scored per game. So they need points. They had the worst rushing offense, like I said. The O-line, not the worst. I mean, it's still a need for maybe an experienced tackle, maybe a better center. But, I mean, it's hard to assess those guys too, like particularly Colton Miller, who has a good rating on PFF. You look at him and he looks accomplished, but then he gave up their most sacks for the year. So you go, okay, well, where does he sit? How happy are they with him? You don't know. The defense fared slightly better than the offense in some parts. They were mid-pack for yards allowed, but they were bottom 7 for points allowed. So they gave up a lot in the red zone, and it was the secondary, which I alluded to, that really struggled. There was their starting cornerbacks and safeties, the guys who played the most snaps, the top 4 snaps in their secondary. They all gave up a passer rating of over 100. Jack Jones, like I said, 10 touchdowns, most in the league. Trayvon Merrick, Isaiah Polamao, and Decamerion Richardson as well. All of those guys were above 100 for passer rating, which you're turning every quarterback into a star when you play the Raiders. And then the next worst was Nate Hobbs, and he gave up a 96 passer rating across the course of the season. So they gave up a bunch of touchdowns in the air. So they desperately need that to be addressed. The D-line, look, if Wilkins and Crosby stay fit next year, that's a strength because Tyree Wilson came on this year. He actually had a nice season. Oh, I didn't go through sack stats earlier. Let me go back to that and tell you the sack stats because that's very important when it comes to a defense. So it was Max Crosby that led with 7.5. He had 15 last year, so he was down on that, but he missed 5 games. Adam Butler, the DT, had 5. Chase on the defensive end had 5, and Tyree Wilson had 4.5. So he showed a lot of promise there. The needs, what are the needs in order? Well, let's go quarterback, obviously. We know they need that. Safety, whether it's cornerback or safety in the secondary. They just need players who don't give up massive plays constantly. That's what they need. They also need skill position players because they've got Jacoby Myers as the wide receiver 1. They've got not a lot else. Terrace Marshall Jr. is their wide receiver 3 at the moment, if you remember him from Carolina. They also need a running back. So put skill position players as number 3, and then, like I said, maybe some experience on the O-line. So pretty much everything other than linebackers and the D-line. They need a center. They need everything. So let's see where they go. I think it'll be one of those hybrid off seasons for the Raiders. They will draft a QB in round 1, and then they will sort of do the Arizona approach from a couple of years ago, use a bunch of picks to get a player in every position of need, and then go for some experienced players in free agency as well. And a great model for that actually is the Commanders, because you look at what they did in the offseason. They drafted beautifully with the quarterback, obviously. They got that right. But they also went and got some experience and guys that weren't particularly glamorous. We were looking at Austin Eckler going, Eckler's washed, but he played a nice part. We looked at Bobby Wagner and go, Bobby Wagner? I mean, how old is this dude? 34, and he looks slow as a tank. He's had a great season. Frankie Louvu, he's a little hipster player. We should have put him in our hipster team of the year last night. He was a great pickup. So these guys that aren't glamorous, that don't cost a heck of a lot of money, but add experience when others maybe think that they're washed. If you get those guys right, it's great. If you get it wrong, you get the New York Jets. But if you get it right, you get the Commanders. So we'll see where the Raiders go next year. I hope that wasn't all doom and gloom for your Raiders fans. You got some positives. You got Brock Bowers. You beat the Baltimore Ravens. You've got Jackson Powers-Johnson, who's on the rise. You've got Tyree Wilson, your second-year edge rusher, who's on the rise. So, there are some pieces. Now, you got to get the coach right. You got to get the quarterback right. Good luck next year. Let's see what Tom Brady can do.